When you leave in silence, you don't just end a relationship, you collapse the false inner world of a narcissist. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And if there is one form of darkness hardest to face, it's the distorted ego of a narcissist." To Jung, narcissism is not merely a personality disorder, it's the tragic consequence of an empty self, desperately creating masks to cover a deep-rooted fear, the fear of being unseen, unrecognized, and ultimately non-existent. When you walk away, especially without reacting, you don't just remove attention, you remove the mirror they needed to maintain their illusion of self. In today's video, we will uncover the 5 psychological stages of a narcissist's breakdown after you leave. From denial, rage, replacement, to the final silent collapse, each stage reveals another mask cracking open, another layer of ego falling apart. Stay with us until the end, because you won't just understand them, you'll understand yourself, and why choosing truth over illusion was the bravest thing you ever did. Stage 1. Denial. When the ego rejects reality right after you leave, a narcissist's first reaction isn't sorrow, it's preservation of the illusion. Carl Jung once said that the ego instinctively rejects anything that threatens its illusion of omnipotence. And for a narcissist, that ego is built entirely on external reflections, especially from you. When you disappear, especially in silence, they don't ask, "What did I do wrong?" They don't reflect on the relationship with honesty. Instead, they instantly activate their default defense mechanism, denial. They tell themselves, "You'll come back. You're just playing a game to get attention. This is a test and I know how to win." But this denial isn't just a comforting thought. It's a psychological scaffolding they rely on to survive. Because to admit that you left due to their manipulation, coldness, or lack of empathy would be to admit that their entire identity is flawed. As Jung noted, people would rather live in illusion than face a truth that wounds their ego. During this phase, they appear fine. You'll see smiling selfies, cheerful outings, bold declarations of independence. But don't be fooled, this isn't joy, it's performance. They're not trying to convince the world they're okay, they're trying to convince themselves they haven't lost control. Meanwhile, your silence acts like a slow, steady blade slicing through their carefully crafted mask. Every day you don't respond, don't reach out, don't fall back into the cycle, their confidence begins to crack. They start watching your social media more often, reading every post, analyzing every story, searching desperately for a sign that you still care. If they find none, or worse, if they see you peaceful, grounded, and genuinely thriving, their denial starts to fracture. That's when they might test the waters with a soft message. "Heard this song and thought of you," or "just checking in, hope you're okay." But these are not heartfelt gestures, they're emotional traps. A way to gauge, are you still under their influence? If you reply, even slightly, it confirms their illusion, "I still have power." But if you remain silent, firm in your boundary, denial can't hold forever. Reality begins to seep in, not with a scream, but with a quiet emptiness. For the first time, they sense this may not be temporary, that something deeper has changed, and from this growing fracture, a storm begins to gather, ushering them into stage 2, rage and panic. Stage 2, rage and panic, when the ego begins to crack. Once denial is no longer strong enough to shield them from reality, another wave rises from within, rage and panic. But this isn't the kind of anger a mature adult feels. This is a toxic cocktail of wounded ego, loss of control, and fear of being forgotten. Carl Jung once said, "What you do not make conscious will manifest as fate." And in this stage, the narcissist begins to be consumed by the very fate they've spent a lifetime avoiding. They can no longer pretend you'll return. They no longer feel certain that they still own you. And so their deepest fear begins to form. You no longer need them. This realization wounds their ego in a primal way. The rage doesn't come from missing you, it comes from not being able to dominate you anymore. They aren't grieving a lost love. They're reacting to the loss of emotional control. Your silence, your peace, your refusal to respond, it's all a loud message. They've lost their grip. During this phase, they may begin to display subtle provocations, passive-aggressive texts, backhanded compliments, or bold statements about how they've found someone better. But none of this comes from genuine emotion. It's all a test to provoke a reaction. Because if you respond with jealousy, anger, or defense, you're feeding their starving ego. Yet if you stay silent, if you resist the bait, the rage has nowhere to go. And that's when it morphs into quiet panic. Unable to make you jealous, unable to trigger you, they begin to feel like they're losing their grasp on reality. They become disoriented, not dramatically, but in subtle, manipulative ways, stalking your online presence, spreading false narratives, or trying to control how others perceive you. Some narcissists escalate the performance. They post intimate photos with a new person, flaunt a seemingly perfect new relationship, not out of love, but as a desperate performance to convince themselves they still matter. But deep down, they know something's changed. They can't predict your next move. You're no longer the emotional puppet they once controlled. And it's that unpredictability that terrifies them most. You've become unreadable, untouchable. The ideal supply they once relied on is now gone. And from this growing instability, the narcissist becomes frantic. That's when they make a snap decision to seek a replacement and restart the cycle. Stage 3, replacement and ego reconstruction, when the shadow takes over. As the rage fades and their manipulative tactics no longer work, the narcissist enters a familiar but haunting space: emptiness. With you gone, the one who once mirrored their false self, they are forced to confront what remains. But instead of looking inward, they rush to find a new mirror, a new supply, in a desperate attempt to glue the fragments of their crumbling identity back together. Carl Jung referred to the hidden unconscious part of ourselves as the shadow, the parts we reject and repress. For the narcissist, this shadow is unbearable. To face it would require inner honesty, a capacity for self-reflection they never developed. So instead of integration, they choose substitution. They seek out someone new, not to love, but to escape themselves. This new person isn't a soulmate. They're a tool, a distraction, a placeholder. And so begins the same old cycle: love bombing, over-the-top affection, idealized promises. But this time, it's all faster and hollower. There's no emotional depth, only performance. No connection, only repetition. From Jung's lens, this is the ego desperately trying to reassemble itself through external projection. The narcissist posts photos, crafts sweet captions, and performs affection not to show love, but to convince themselves that they've replaced you. Yet, in their subconscious, they know the truth. No one mirrors them the way you once did. Over time, comparisons creep in quietly, even if never spoken aloud. They recall how you saw through their mask, how your silence wasn't manipulation but protection, how your love wasn't performative but grounded in presence. And this realization terrifies them, because the new person, though more compliant and easier to control, doesn't make them feel seen, doesn't make them feel real. So the cycle begins again: fast affection, shallow connection, and creeping disillusionment. They say the right words, but feel nothing. They try to rebuild a shattered ego with illusion and haste, but the more they chase replacement, the more they fall into inner fragmentation, the very breakdown Jung warned of when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And now, that very fate, the inescapable truth that you cannot be replaced, begins pulling them into the next stage of collapse, the silent disintegration of the self. Stage 4, the silent collapse, when there's no one left to reflect them. After all the performances, hasty replacements, and failed manipulation tactics, the narcissist enters the place they fear most: true silence. This isn't the kind of silence used to provoke or bait you. It's not a tactic. This is the crushing emptiness that arrives when there's no one left to reflect them, no one left to extract emotion from. Carl Jung described this as entering the shadow, the moment a person can no longer escape their unconscious self. For a narcissist, this is a dangerous threshold, because they lack the internal foundation needed to self-sustain. Without someone else to define them, they're forced to look inward, and they see nothing. Outwardly, they may appear fine. They still smile, post pictures, go to work. But if you look into their eyes, you'll notice something missing. The light has dimmed. Life loses meaning because everything that once motivated them, control, validation, emotional attention, is now gone. And as those sources vanish, their sense of identity begins to disintegrate. Jung once said, "The most terrifying loneliness is not being alone, it's not knowing who you are." And that's exactly what unfolds here. Narcissists don't know how to self-soothe. They've never learned how to process pain without someone to blame. They don't have the emotional tools to grieve, only the instinct to withdraw. You may notice they disappear from social media, or conversely, become loudly performative, trying to prove they're just fine. But either extreme is a symptom of one truth. They're collapsing internally. They begin to repeat the past, scrolling through old photos, playing familiar songs, rereading old messages, not because they love you, but because they want to find themselves in your eyes again. But the painful truth is, you once saw who they really were, and now even they cannot. This is when dissociation from reality begins. Some will turn to addictions, overworking, or meaningless intimacy, anything intense enough to numb the feeling. But the more they run, the deeper they fall into a void with no center, where there's no you, no mirror, no ego, just a dark and formless self. And in this darkness, two possibilities start to form. Either they will finally confront their inner shadow and step onto the path of true transformation, or they will spiral further into the final stage, total collapse, or the rare reconstruction of the authentic self. Stage 5. Reconstructing the self or total collapse, the final confrontation with the shadow. After all the denial, rage, replacements, and silent collapse, the narcissist reaches the final crossroads. Here, there's no one left to blame, no more emotional supply to extract, no more fake relationships to mask the inner void. They are forced to look inward toward a soul they've long rejected. Carl Jung referred to this moment as the death of the ego, when the false self shatters and one no longer knows who they are. This is an excruciating stage, but it also holds the rare potential for rebirth. A small number of narcissists, after hitting true rock bottom, begin the journey inward. And for the first time they may whisper, "I don't know who I am." If they are humble and brave enough, they may seek therapy, meditation, or some form of spiritual guidance. They begin to learn responsibility not as a tactic, but as an honest admission of consequences. They start to understand love not as control, but as presence. And they accept that who they were must die in order for something real to be reborn. But this path is extremely rare, because walking it means dismantling every defense mechanism they've ever built. It means admitting that the image they projected of power, charm, superiority was an illusion. Most cannot do this, and so they choose the other path, repetition filled with increasing desperation. They restart the cycle, new target, love bombing, control, disillusionment, discard. But this time there's no passion, no fire, only numbness and habit. They become a shell of who they once pretended to be, a hollow replica moving through life without direction or meaning. Some become even more dangerous, not because they seek power, but because they feel they have nothing left to lose. They manipulate not for connection, but to prove to themselves they still exist. They hurt others not for pleasure, but because they have no other outlet for their internal pain. For those who once loved a narcissist, especially super empaths, this is the moment to accept a painful but liberating truth. You cannot save them, and you are not responsible for doing so. You loved deeply. You forgave. You hoped. But healing cannot be outsourced. It begins only when a person chooses to face their own truth. And if they refuse, then their collapse is not your fault. Maybe one day, in a quiet moment, they will remember you not with rage or desire to dominate, but with a quiet ache of regret, because they'll know you were the only one who truly saw them, even the parts they couldn't face. And you were also the one brave enough to walk away, not out of hate, but because you chose truth over illusion. That was not betrayal. That was awakening.